Aw, nuts to this.
Royal Space Force, The Wings of Honnêamise, Honey Mayonnaise, is one of those movies where the story of how it was made is surprisingly more interesting than the final product itself. It is a film conceived and constructed by young, inexperienced nobodies who would go on to become some of the biggest names in the anime industry. It started Studio Gainax and was the first feature-length anime to ever be produced by Bandai. Yes, that Bandai. Now, this film is not for everyone, though. I cannot emphasize this point enough. In fact, Gainax wanted to make something so different with Royal Space Force that they actively avoided every anime trope of the day. They focused on making it a political and existential story, leaving in only smidgens of any kind of levity and only a few short action sequences. Gainax instead focused on the human drama of a world on the brink of war, a country in the middle of a depression, and a man questioning his own existence and the reasons for everyone's selfish actions around him. This is not another Naruto, Attack on Titan, or even Full Metal Alchemist. Royal Space Force is a slow burn of a movie that is supposed to make you think. Well, at least more than your average Detective Conan movie. Now, before I jump into the history and production of this, some would argue, masterpiece of animation, I will give you a quick synopsis of the movie in order to remind you of the major plot points and character moments if you've already seen it, or to let you understand the context of the history of the film if you haven't yet seen it. I'll try to be brief. The plot. Royal Space Force begins with a young man on a seaside cliff watching in awe as some jets take off from an aircraft carrier on a cold winter's day. This boy, one Shirotsugu Ladat, tells us that he always dreamed of flying jets in the Air Force, just like Tom Cruise, but he was too damn stupid to get into that program, so instead he settled for the laughingstock branch of the military,
Space Force!
The Space Force is composed of a handful of lazy individuals who are doing their best to keep their heads down and not die horribly due to urine bags bursting and shorting out the electrical systems during training exercises. The space program is on its last legs when the story starts, and it even has trouble launching small Sputnik-sized unmanned satellites into orbit, but the general in charge of the underfunded division, one General Caden, believes beyond all sane thinking that putting a man into orbit is not only possible in their 1950s-era technologically equivalent world, but that it is his duty to be the one to do it.
It's not that kind of duty.
One night, after a comrade's funeral, the one who died from the urine bag malfunction, the Space Force team heads to the red light district for some kinky fun. But Shiro gets third-wheeled pretty quickly because he's a complete dullard. Then he stumbles into a religious cultist girl handing out pamphlets and talking about sin, doom, and gloom on a busy sidewalk. Shiro takes one of her flyers and decides to head to the address listed on it the next day since he has nothing else to do, and he found the girl to be cute. I guess if he can't even score with a whore, might as well aim to bang a nun in training. This woman, Rikini, I think that's how you pronounce it, her name is really only spoken once and it's hard to hear, is as dull and one-track minded as cultists get, only wanting to talk about God and how the world sucks right now. But in telling her what his job is, Shiro, who thinks being in the Space Force is a waste of the kingdom's time and money, is surprised that the girl is excited about his position and the very existence of this quasi-military force. Through their chat, she tells him that his ability to possibly leave this festering planet is behind and go out into unspoiled space, leading the way for humanity's children to live among the stars in peace, is an amazing blessing. As if humans wouldn't pull its collective hate, violence, and their petty wars with them if they ever moved off planet, but she's a dreamer. Anyway, Rikini gets Shiro all excited about his job for once, and to the surprise of his comrades in the Space Force, he volunteers to be the first man sent into orbit. We then get a quick montage where Shiro goes from one unnecessarily silly training device to another, and we begin to learn a lot more about the politics of the world at large and the Space Force in detail. You see, due to the depression that's gripping the nation, as well as the rather large budget already being allocated to a non-fighting branch of the military, General Caden uses some less than legal means and family connections to fund the actual rocket that will send our lad Shiro into the great beyond. I mean the great beyond of outer space, not death. At least that's what they hope for. But the Defense Ministry is looking for a reason to start something with their neighbor and enemy to the south in order to boost a sagging national morale, to get a chance to view their more advanced jets and weaponry in action, as well as a way to write off the expenditure of such a large portion of the national budget for something that isn't very useful in their eyes, a non-fighting branch of the military, like the
Space Force!
So the launch location for the Space Force's Shiro satellite gets moved to right next door to the demilitarized zone next to their bordering enemy, in the hopes that this adversarial nation will instigate an attack and capture the expensive rocket. And even if there's no actual war, they plan to push for heavy reparations from their neighbor for violating their border to attain said rocket. It's a win-win situation for the Ministry, just not so much for Shiro and Kaden. But back to our idiot hero. Totally depressed that he's being accused of being a part of a government conspiracy, major corruption, and having the Space Force hogging up funds that could house around 60,000 homeless people, Shiro heads back to Rikini's place to try and mend. There he witnesses the small hypocrisy that she is living, claiming to be a woman who lives only to serve others and someone who detests all forms of sin, but she's also hoarding a bit of money while half the country starves. And after stewing on it for an evening, Shiro decides that since she's being a hypocrite, he can be one too, and so he figures it's the perfect time to sexually assault the poor girl. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ. Up until this very moment, Shiro has been a dopey but likable guy, and then this scene just comes from out of fucking nowhere. I'll get into it a bit more later, but once again, what
the actual Gainax?
After that, Shiro is almost assassinated by a well-trained enemy agent, and then he has an awkward goodbye with Rikini, who insists that he's done nothing wrong even though
he tried to rape her.
Then we go to the launch site. It is at the border of the demilitarized zone as stated before, and the launch HQ is set up in some old World War I-like trenches and bunkers far from the rocket itself. On the day of the launch, General Kaden, knowing that he's a pawn in a larger and stupid political game and that his career dream is about to be destroyed right in front of his eyes, suddenly orders the rocket to be primed to go 2 hours earlier than was originally planned and publicized due to the enemy nation being leaked info from inside the ministry to make their confiscation of the spacecraft easier. This is a genius move, but of course his men freak out, telling him that the extra time is essential for safety checks, but he won't hear it. Things almost completely fall apart until Shiro pops his head in and, in an act of surprising competence, says that it's okay by him since if the enemy attacks, there'll be no real defense by their kingdom anyway. Just as the rocket is primed, the fuel and Shiro are loaded into it and the countdown is about to start, the kingdom's army sends a messenger that the launch base and rocket are to be abandoned immediately due to the enemy approaching their position. Shiro once again talks them into ignoring this and pushing forward with the launch. Where he grew these newfound giant cojones, I don't know. And why it isn't Kaden or the old scientist and engineer who spent their lives on this rocket being the ones who refused to give in, I also have no idea. I guess Shiro's the protag, so go with it. It is now that the money shots for this entire production take place. You just know that Hideaki Anno, Kenichi
Sonoda,
and the rest of the animation directors and mechanical designers blew their collective wad for this production on this sequence. The battle for the rocket is where the best animation of this flick occurs. Jets, tanks, and foot soldiers fight, things blow up, and the countdown timer ticks away with as much theatrical drama as a climax such as this deserves.
War. It's fantastic.
Then comes the launch. There are a surprising number of rocket launches in major motion pictures over the years, from The Right Stuff to Apollo 13 to First Man, but I'll hold strong to my opinion that Royal Space Force's liftoff leaves them all in the metaphorical dust. From the small details of the ice falling from the rocket as it starts to shake and lift off, to the pure power they hand animated into the exhaust and thrust as it blasts upward through the atmosphere past all the jet fighters and stunned soldiers on both sides as they stop firing out of pure awe. And it perfectly calls back to the opening scene of Shiro himself transfixed on the plains when he was just a child. This is fucking art. After the successful liftoff, we listen and watch as Shiro waxes on poetically about life, the universe, and everything, and history and sin, as his capsule reaches escape velocity and finally a stable orbit. Then we're treated to a long and very confusing look back at some of Shiro's childhood, as well as a history presentation of this strange world in an attempt to capture the weirdness of 2001: A Space Odyssey's final 20 minutes. Once again, oh my god, this movie is not for everyone. The last shot is of Rikini, still handing out flyers in the red light district. It starts to snow, and she's the only one who looks up. And scene. The production history. As I stated before, the history and production of Royal Space Force is possibly more interesting than the movie itself. It all began with the fan-made openings to the Daikon 3 and Daikon 4 sci-fi conventions by some up-and-coming university students who called their company Daikon Film. In 1985, they changed their name to Gainax, and studio co-founders Hiroyuki Yamaga and Toshio Okada brought forth a proposal for an animated feature called Royal Space Force to the newly founded Bandai Corporation's Emotion Anime unit. Yamaga and Okada had already met and were on good terms with Shigeru Watanabe of Bandai through their figure-making company, General Products, and their proposal for their project, which was a short synopsis and setting description with no character names included, but over 24 beautiful watercolored images by resident character designer Yoshiyuki Sadamoto, impressed Watanabe, who then brought it to Bandai's president as the company's next production after Mamoru Oshii's Dalos. President Yamashina is quoted as saying, "I'm not sure what this is all about, but that's exactly why I like it." Whatever, dude. The ragtag group of early 20-something-year-old amateur animators, featuring what would soon become the who's who in the anime industry, got cracking on a 4-minute pilot film to see if the project could be saleable. This short pilot film, which didn't quite have the character and mechanical designs down yet, and looked very Ghibli-esque in order to make it appear like auteur Miyazaki's popular works at the time, was shown to many inside Bandai by Watanabe, and Watanabe even took it to Hayao Miyazaki himself, thinking his clout could convince the rest of the Bandai board to get behind the project. It worked so well that Bandai upped Gainax's budget from around 40 million yen to over 800 million yen and pushed it from being a straight-to-video production to an all-out theatrical release, Bandai's first ever feature film.
I said, goddamn!
The soon-to-be famous group that made up Gainax at the time is as follows: Hideaki Anno, Hiroyuki Yamaga, Yoshiyuki Sadamoto, Hiromasa Ogura, Ryuichi Sakamoto,
Kenichi Sonoda,
and Hiroaki Inoue. These guys would go on to help create and produce some of the biggest anime series and movies that Japan has ever known. Gainax took their new cash flow and moved their headquarters from Osaka to Shinjuku, Tokyo, and began designing and fleshing out the world of Royal Space Force in earnest. Director Yamaga actually scrapped all of the world-building designs from the pilot film because they just weren't unique or alien enough for the final product. The item, mechanical, and world designs, everything from the phones to spoons to coins to musical instruments to planes, were completely recreated in order to be familiar enough to understand what they were, but to tweak sufficiently to let us know that we're looking at a strange alternate world and definitely not our own Earth. It is actually extremely impressive just how detailed everything in this world is. Even the chairs look slightly otherworldly. It was this amount of detail that Gainax poured into the whole production. Yamaga actually didn't bother finishing the script until his designers provided him with a fully realized world that he could then populate with his ideas. Pretty much the exact opposite of how most movies were and are still made. The only notable design exception that Yamaga wanted for the film was, ironically, for the final rocket itself. He had his artists base it on an actual Soviet rocket in order to make it clear to viewers that it could indeed take off and wouldn't fail when they first saw it. Miyazaki is famous for his disapproval of this decision, claiming it was one of the only things Royal Space Force did wrong. They changed the very shape of coins in the movie, but they couldn't be bothered making a unique rocket for the pivotal final act, he complained. But Miyazaki is a Mr. Cranky Pants, and I'm sure he would have found something else to bitch about in this movie, even if the rocket was alien enough for his tastes. Character designs from the pilot film were tossed out and remade from scratch too, since Yamaga didn't want your typical teen or 20-something attractive leads in the film, which is how Shiro and Rikini were initially drawn. Anyway, a distributor for Royal Space Force was not found until January 1986. That would be Toho, famous for their Godzilla and Kurosawa movies. And storyboarding for the flick, the process of making still drawings of every scene showing camera angles, objects, and indicating motions for everything, as well as fleshing out the movie's tone and pace, continued until just 10 months before what would eventually be the film's release date. That is insane! Storyboarding is typically done early on in film production in order for the director to time everything out prior to spending shitloads of money and man-hours doing the actual animation on celluloid. However, due to the entire crew of Royal Space Force being noobs in the industry and thriving on experimentation, production often worked backwards. You ever see that Christopher Nolan movie Tenet? Yeah, that piece of shit is what happens when people try to work backwards making a film. Another example of the pure chaos that went into the making of Royal Space Force and Gainax Productions in general for a while was that at the end of official production, out of close to 100 adjustments made to retake scenes, only 3 of those were suggestions made by director Yamaga himself. The rest were contrived by the animators and other crew who thought their changes made things better. Maybe they did, but Christ, that is insane. The animators just took it upon themselves to make changes to the final film. The lack of a strict hierarchy for modifications made to an 800 million yen film like that is mind-boggling. It'd be like if the President of the United States wrote out an executive order to make Captain America's birthday a national holiday, but the intern at the copy machine decided that it'd be better if they instead made it Red Skull Day and changed the document appropriately on his own. What the hell were they thinking? While the movie was nearing completion, concern for its non-traditional storytelling and saleability started to rear its ugly corporate head again. But instead of trying to re-edit or fix any of the film itself, Bandai and the film's sponsors figured that they could simply change the movie's name to something more romantic or exciting, and that would fix their fears. Royal Space Force, which is how the movie was pitched and was used since the very beginning, was no longer good enough for them. Big sponsor, All Nippon Airways, insisted that they somehow put the word wings in the title. Bandai wanted the title to read something of something to match Miyazaki's big hit, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which was a huge hit a few years prior and was still in people's minds. After shooting down garbage like Myth of Passion, Song of Icarus, and Wings of Rikini, they eventually settled on Wings of Honnêamise - Royal Space Force. Honnêamise being the name of the kingdom that most of the events in the movie take place in, but the name is only mentioned like 1 or 2 times during the course of the flick. It should be noted that Gainax hated the Wings of Honnêamise part of the title and preferred the movie to only be known as Royal Space Force, which it was once it eventually reached home video in Japan. As production neared completion, Gainax's relationship with Bandai was getting more and more strained, to the point where Gainax producer Okada thought that the studio might be replaced at that late date with another animation studio, or that the plug might be pulled entirely and the movie canceled.
Oh no! Anyway.
Despite this meaning that either Watanabe or President Yamashina himself might be forced to resign from Bandai in disgrace over the project's failure. On top of the naming issues, terribly deceptive advertising by Toho played the movie up as a sort of sister film to Nausicaa. Their advertisements in both print and trailers made Royal Space Force out to be a super dramatic romance action film. FYI, it is none of those things, with a tagline of,
"Do you believe in love's miracle?"
The film died at the box office, not even making back half its budget. It was criticized by numerous reviewers for being boring and pretentious, which it kind of is, and the movie-going public wasn't impressed with it by and large. Luckily for Gainax and Bandai though, Royal Space Force did very well on home video and won praises from many top people in the industry, including Hayao Miyazaki himself. Oh, and to add insult to injury to Gainax, Royal Space Force's world premiere was held at Mann's Chinese Theater in Los Angeles, where a few B-list celebrities showed up for it. Michael Biehn was there, and he had already starred in Terminator and Aliens by this time. Yeah, I'll give them that. But the film was dubbed into English, and the dub was fucking atrocious. They changed key lines in the story and renamed the characters with Americanized names like Randy and Diane instead of Shirotsugu and Rikini. Randy? Diane? Oh my god. And they retitled the movie Star Quest. I'm sure Yamaga is still pissed off about that one. It took 7 years for Bandai to make a profit from Royal Space Force, though it almost completely bankrupted Studio Gainax. The film found a sort of international renaissance starting in 1994 when Manga Entertainment released a more accurately dubbed version of it in the States and the United Kingdom. Roger Ebert saw it and liked it, giving it 3 out of 4 stars. But it never became a big-name anime hit like Akira, Tenchi Muyo, or Dragon Ball Z. Even though it was an important stepping stone for Studio Gainax on their way to dominating the 1990s anime industry with hits like Nadia and Evangelion, Royal Space Force slowly faded from notoriety and is mostly known as that strange movie that Gainax fever dreamed up before making Gunbuster. I gotta tell you, I would totally watch a documentary or movie based on the making of Royal Space Force. They might have to tone down some of the craziness to make it more believable, though. Thoughts? What do I think of Royal Space Force? It's complicated. When I first watched the English dub of it in 1994, back when I was initially getting into anime and bought everything that popped up in my local Suncoast video store, I forced myself to love it, knowing that it was by the studio that made the amazing Gunbuster and really fun Nadia series. I've probably seen the movie with various dubs and in its original language about 7 or 8 times by now, and although I can still appreciate the magnificent amount of design work that went into it, I can also see a whole lot of flaws and cracks in its presentation. It's kind of like an animated Monet in that regard. Let me explain. Royal Space Force was purposefully written and designed as a way to show that anime could be more than cool giant robots and cutesy girls and animals. The founders of Gainax were kind of embarrassed by the image of the average otaku. See Otaku no Video for a clearer sense of what they thought of the typical anime fan at the time. And they were hoping to use this movie as a means, and I quote, to make anime fans reaffirm reality. They were sick of stories that had way too cool and way too young characters in charge of major political decisions and world-changing events. They wanted anime fans to experience a more grounded story while still inspiring them to not be your average otaku shut-ins. Yeah, that's laughable in hindsight after seeing that their focus for the next decade was on exactly that, young, attractive kids saving the world. See Gunbuster, Nadia, and Evangelion as prime examples of this. While that is an admirable goal, and there are a lot of likable characters in Royal Space Force, other than the main protagonist and his brainwashed spiritual advisor, none of the other dozen roles stand out in any way, shape, or form. The only characters whose names I even remembered after watching this flick multiple times in my life are Shirotsugu Ladat, the main character, Rikini, the indoctrinated cultist whom Shiro gets involved with, and Space Force General Caden, whose dream is to put a man to space no matter the financial, physical, or mental cost. The rest of the cast are basically background characters who provide no real inspiration for anyone else, and who only exist to question Shiro's sanity for volunteering to put his life in unnecessary danger by sitting on top of a giant rocket and getting blasted out of the stratosphere in the middle of a war zone. After my most recent viewing, I asked my fellow movie watchers to give me the names of the other characters beyond Shiro, Rikini, and General Caden. The most they could come up with was, those old scientists and engineers? Or, that little girl who never said anything and was always picking her nose. And, Shiro's fellow Space Force people? That is not a good indication of great writing, and it shows that Gainax went a little too far in making things grounded and not cool. There is always a balance that needs to be made. I will always back up the visual designs of this movie, though. I love almost everything about this strange alien world. I love the super flamboyant Space Force uniforms, the small changes to normal everyday items that we take for granted, and the overall toned-down color palette of the whole thing. Gainax made a very lived-in, fully believable, exotic world for this tale to take place in, and I applaud them for it. Yamaga's desire and perfectionism, is that a word? Is the thing that even the movie's worst critics still complimented it over, and for good reason. The basic plot of the movie is very good too. The Space Force is a joke within the Ministry of Defense. People outside the military don't even know it exists. The general in charge pushes hard for his dream of manned spaceflight and uses some illegal means to finance it. The Ministry has no use for the Space Force and tries to set it up to fail or be captured by their bordering enemy as a means to recover all the funds sunk into it. And through all this, we follow a dumb sap in the Force who surprisingly gets invigorated in the quest to go into space by another dumb sap who's in a cult and who doesn't understand the basics of being an adult herself. That is an interesting story. It's really only the execution of the story that stumbles and doesn't quite pack as much of an emotional punch as later Gainax works do. I mean, the end of Gunbuster is heart-wrenching, the finale of Nadia is epic and impassioned, and all of Evangelion is a poignant roller coaster. Royal Space Force, especially in comparison, is functional, but I don't think it's much more than that. And now, let me dive into that one scene. Okay. So, Shiro hangs out with Rikini a lot because he initially finds her to be cute, but then his white knight syndrome kicks in, and he feels he has to help the barely functional woman because her life is a goddamn mess. Shiro never goes in for Rikini's religious beliefs, but he does admire her determination and faith that her god is true. That gives him the push to believe that he can make a difference with his beliefs too. That's pretty powerful plotting. I like it so far. But then, after some bad shit happens to him, Shiro's faith in the Space Force and humanity as a whole is put into question. He throws all his money that he has on him to some homeless people, and he goes to see Rikini again. While at her place, he notices that she's hoarding some money, despite what she's always telling him about doing for others first, and the only true path is the light from God. Now, in actuality, this act of holding onto some cash in the middle of a depression, especially when she has a little girl she needs to take care of, makes perfect sense and should actually be admired, but Shiro sees it as a pure act of hypocrisy because he's a f***ing dense moron, and after some pondering and listening to Rikini and Mana pray that night, a rambling prayer that in Shiro's mind means that good intentions will always be perverted by the hand, and flesh can sin if the spirit asks for forgiveness. It's an inevitable circle, and so he figures, well, if she can be a hypocrite, so can I. And he sexually assaults her and is about to rape her when he sees the pain he is causing and stops, giving Rikini time to smash a well-deserved vase into the side of his head. The only plot point that this scene leads to, or guides the protagonist to, is him questioning later on to a colleague if one can be the villain in his own life story. That's it. Other than that, you could totally cut the assault scene out with no repercussions to the overall plot, or even Shiro's character growth. And hell, due to everything else Shiro has witnessed and done in the story up to when he asks if he could be the villain, being part of a corrupt military organization and killing a man, even if the man was trying to kill him first, even without that assault scene, Shiro's ponderings still make sense. I have no idea if this scene is only in the movie because of a cultural thing or a sign of the times in Japan, or if writer and director Yamaga either truly dislikes his protagonist or the Rikini character. I am convinced that the only thing that Shiro's attack on Rikini does is make the audience hate him. At least it should. If you watch that scene and think, she had it coming, then you, sir or madam, are a royal piece of shit. That's all I have to say about that. The music in Royal Space Force is so strange and a bit off-putting at first, but it really does fit this world well. It's almost like an alien heard some of our best orchestrated music on Earth and tried to replicate it, but with instruments that don't have enough strings or keys or whatever to do it properly. You get used to it shortly after starting it, and I honestly still have some of the melodies stuck in my head several days now after watching it again. The last thing that I want to talk about is Blue Uru, the proposed sequel to Royal Space Force that, so far, never was. I remember reading about Blue Uru in magazines like Anime FX back in the mid-90s. It was supposed to take place 100 years after Royal Space Force, when the world that Shiro lived on developed not only regular space flights since the original movie, but interstellar travel. From what I recall, it was supposed to be about someone in the Space Force actually making it to our modern-day Earth. Sounded weird and interesting to me, and it keeps popping up in Gainax's future releases from time to time since then. I'll watch it if it ever gets made, but I'm not holding my breath. Garbage or gold? I initially went into this most recent viewing of Royal Space Force thinking, oh, this thing is solid gold for sure. It's classic Gainax, right? But after watching it again, I can see that it is not a solid 10 or an A+ film. Do all the flaws I previously mentioned make this movie unwatchable? No, far from it. I believe that if you like imaginative narratives with likable characters and unique and interesting worlds and can stand a little slow drama, you will totally enjoy it. I would venture to give Royal Space Force a solid B, if that attempted rape scene wasn't in it, making you really dislike the main character at a pivotal point in the story. I would probably give it a B+.
I lost. Earwax.
Is Royal Space Force the best thing Gainax ever made? No, it is not. That would be He Is My Master. I'm just fucking with you. Their best work is the autobiographical Otaku no Video. My god, do they hate the average anime fan. If I had to choose between labeling this flick as either garbage or gold, and I do as I make the rules up here, I'd say that Royal Space Force is a historic gold, meaning it is well worth watching just to see what a game changer in the industry it was, and how crazy, inventive, and experimental Gainax went with not only their debut anime, but their debut 800 million yen feature film. Art direction and design get a score of 98% from me. World building gets 93%. Plot and narrative structure? 87%. Execution of the plot? 60%. Characters and their development? Probably a 78%.
That one f***ing scene, man, it just set this thing back so much.
Combined, that makes for an 83% total.
That's a solid B right there.
Not too shabby.
So it's up to you. Watch it or not. I don't care. Christ, I was just sitting there.
Space Force.